Hello and welcome to the Walrus Talks. It's happening now, presented by Concordia University. I'm Jennifer Hollett. I am the Executive Director of the Walrus. I'm also a proud Concordia grad, and I am thrilled to be your host this evening. How's everyone feeling? All right. We're excited to be back here in Ottawa at the National Gallery of Canada, but we're also streaming live online at thewalrus.ca. So hello to the over 400 households tuning in across the country and around the world. I'm gonna listen. I think they're giving us emojis right now. Excellent. You are most welcome as well. We encourage you, whether you're in this room or online, to be a part of this conversation on social media. So you can tag us on any of the platforms at The Walrus or use our hashtag Walrus Talks. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we are gathered on the traditional unceded territory, Anishinaabe Algonquin territory, in Canada's capital city. Ottawa is home today to a diversity of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples, and we're honored to contribute and carry on a long history of storytelling. We encourage you to reflect on the land that you're on, whether you're here in Ottawa or joining us from elsewhere online. This year, the Walrus turns 20. And we're celebrating 20 years of Canada's conversation, and we're taking a look at who we are now. And it was fun to watch that opening video and hear the audience in conversation. You can find our stories wherever you're looking for them, online at thewalrus.ca, in print, on newsstands, or by subscribing directly to The Walrus. You can also listen to our podcasts or join our event series like this one. And this work is truly powered by our donors, our supporters, and our partners. So thank you for being here and being a part of this, but especially to Concordia University for working with us on this event. To kick things off, please welcome Graham Carr, who's the President and Vice Chancellor at Concordia.
Thanks, Jen, and good evening, everybody. It's great to see you all. So it's terrific to be back, and the last time we were here, we sure didn't have a crowd this size, so it's great to see so many people. I have to say, as I was walking into the gallery tonight, I don't know if you noticed it, but there's a huge banner on the outside advertising an exhibition which is going to start later this month, featuring Deanna Bowen. And Deanna Bowen is a faculty member at Concordia University, so I feel right at home in this building here tonight. And especially to be here with Jen, who we're super proud of, a great Concordia alumnus. And also tonight, you're going to meet two of our outstanding young faculty members, Alexandra Lesnikowski, who leads our Climate Change Adaptation Research Lab at the university, works a lot on climate change and public policy, so Ottawa is a great city to be talking about that. And Aphrodite Salas, who some of you may remember as a veteran journalist at CTV, now a professor of journalism at Concordia University, who most recently partnered with Indigenous Clean Energy, and I know there are people in the room from Indigenous Clean Energy, to do a documentary film that was featured at the last two COP conferences that happened in Egypt and in Montreal this year. So I think, in addition to the other panelists, you're in for a fantastic evening. Some of you may not know too much about Concordia, and for those of you who do, I'm going to give you a little quick refresher course. So we're, of course, based in Montreal. We're a young university about to turn 50 in 24-25. Since 2019, Concordia has been the top-ranked university under 50, not just in Canada, but in North America. And yes, we're going to keep that track record going all the way. We are a university with about 50,000 students, a little more than 50,000 students, coming from more than 150 countries around the world. Speaking dozens and dozens and dozens of languages, and I think that diversity is a huge part of what makes us an innovative, exciting place to be. I was talking with some people at a reception a little earlier on, some of whom either have children at the university or whose children or whose young adults are deciding to go to Concordia in the fall. And one of the things that we announced this past September was that every single undergraduate coming to our university, regardless of their program, will have the opportunity through their academic program to do experiential learning, work-integrated learning, co-op, internship, study abroad, participation in case competitions. All of them will have that opportunity starting this year. And by our anniversary, we want to make sure that they have 2 of those opportunities at least in their career, because the world is a rapidly changing place and we need to think differently about how we prepare students to succeed in the world after graduation. But tonight we're here to talk about climate change, social policy, changing the future, and this is a topic which is absolutely critical for us at the university. Like most universities in Canada, we of course have a sustainable development plan, but we had made an announcement after COP26 that we wanted to achieve net zero in our operations by 2040. And having made that announcement, we then had to sit down and think, well, how are we going to make good on that announcement? So we announced at the Chambre de Commerce in Montreal about 3 weeks ago that we are launching a very ambitious plan called Plan Net Zero, the goal of which is to decarbonize the 80 buildings on our 2 campuses, buildings whose architectural history stretches over 150 years in the city of Montreal, covering just about every epoch of design. And we're focusing on the buildings because they are the major source of gas emissions at the university. But the other beautiful parts of this project are our ambition is to turn our campuses into living labs where companies, public utilities, small, medium enterprises, the city itself, and other researchers can come and work together to develop the innovative solutions that we're going to need to decarbonize the existing infrastructure in Canada. And one of the beautiful things about this project is our goal is to do this at scale by creating on each of our 2 campuses an integrated clean energy sector, which will not only reduce consumption of energy at the university, but store energy, and then working with Hydro-Quebec, feed it back into the grid in the neighborhoods surrounding our campuses. And one of the other reasons why we're focused on this is because it speaks very much to areas of strength at the university, areas of strength in climate research, areas of strength in smart buildings, in electrification, in battery development, in social adaptation to change. And 2 weeks ago, we were thrilled to be awarded by the Government of Canada a $123 million grant for a project called Electrifying Society, the goal of which is, over the course of the next 7 years, to develop a series of pilot projects with partners such as Indigenous Clean Energy and others across the country, with the City of Calgary, with the City of Halifax, with the City of Montreal, the City of Shawinigan, with private and public sector partners, to begin to focus on developing innovative solutions to the green energy challenges of the future, but more than that, to develop solutions that can be applied in affordable ways at the community and neighborhood level in cities across the country from coast to coast to coast. And I'll just close by saying that you don't need to take it from me that these are areas of strength at Concordia. Last year, Times Higher Education, the most reputable university ranking a body in the world, issued a set of rankings of how universities around the globe perform against the UN Sustainable Development Goals. More than 1,400 universities were measured for their work. Concordia ranked 20th in the world for what we're doing on climate change, 5th in the world for what we're doing on smart cities and communities. I think that's pretty good, not just for Concordia, but for Canada as a whole. And that's another reason why we're so happy to be partnering with the Walrus tonight, especially on this topic. Please enjoy the evening, and now back to Jen.
I'm actually a second-generation Concordia grad, and it's amazing from my dad to me to watch Concordia evolve and grow and ultimately lead the way. So thank you for sharing that, Graham. Tonight, you are in for a treat. We have 7 speakers who will have 7 minutes each to share innovations and ideas breaking new ground today that ultimately will improve the world tomorrow. Preparing our communities for a more environmentally sustainable and socially inclusive path forward will take more than one initiative. So tonight we'll hear new ideas on climate technology and policy, inclusive placemaking, equity and justice, sustainable finance, journalism and reconciliation, and more. This work is happening now, so we're excited to get into it. Coming up, we have Bob McDonald, author, and when you hear his voice, you will know him best as the host of CBC's Quirks and Quarks. We also have Dr. Alexandra Lesnikowski, Assistant Professor, Geography, Planning, and Environment at Concordia University. Jeff Daunt, social worker. Sharon Nyangweso, founder and CEO of QuakeLab, Inc. Julie Segal, Senior Program Manager, Climate Finance at Environmental Defense. Aphrodite Salas, Assistant Professor, Journalism at Concordia University, and Megan Leslie, President and CEO of the World Wildlife Fund Canada. Thank you all for joining us.
Hello, I'm Bob McDonald. Now you know what I look like. I've been reporting on the environment since my hair was black and down to my shoulders. My very first job at the CBC was to write a 1-hour documentary on climate change in 1977. And it has been amazing to be a science journalist during all that time and watch all of the predictions that they were making back then come true. They predicted the loss of ice in the Arctic, Greenland, and Antarctica. They predicted sea level rise. They predicted that storms would get stronger, that we would have droughts, wildfires, floods, shifting of the monsoons. It's all come true. In fact, it's come true faster than they predicted. It's also been a little frustrating as a journalist to witness inaction. Can you witness inaction? And this is in part due to a well-funded and well-orchestrated anti-science campaign, climate denial, where misinformation and disinformation was put out into the public to put doubt, seeds of doubt, in the public mind, in the political mind, and in some cases in the media's mind, so that it would delay action and keep business as usual. And it worked. For more than 30 years, it's worked. Well, now climate denial is off the map because climate change is in our face. We're seeing it. I live in British Columbia, and we're dealing with forest fires now. And we're seeing floods, and we're seeing the storms. It's all come true. So I was getting a little depressed. I was getting kind of down because all the stories coming out of the environment that I was reporting on are bad news. More loss of habitat, species going extinct, polluted air, polluted water. You want to go shoot yourself after a while. So I thought, okay, we've spent the last 30 or 40 years pointing at the problem. What are the solutions? So I wrote a book called The Future Is Now, Solving the Climate Crisis with Today's Technology, which just so happens will be in the lobby as you leave. What I wanted to do was put together the latest update on where we are with green energy. And I was delighted to find out when I did the research that all the technology we need to go green already exists. There are no new inventions needed to go to a zero-carbon energy economy. It's already there. We know how to capture the energy of the sun, the wind, the geothermal energy, the tides, the waves. Energy literally grows on trees if we want it. There's no shortage of energy. There's more energy falling out of the sky in 1 hour hitting the Earth than all of humanity uses in a year. It's out there. We just need to gather it up. So if the technology's there, Why haven't we been using it? What's been going on? Well, we got a very nice demonstration of how we can change quickly with the pandemic. Think about it. There was an invisible threat to humanity drifting through the air that was killing people by the thousands. And 4 elements came together to fight it. 1, science. The Chinese scientists, to their credit, when they identified the virus in Wuhan, they immediately did its genome, its genetic sequence, and they sent that out to the world. And there was a huge international effort, including here in Canada, to figure out how that virus infects your lungs and how it kills. The science was first. 2, industry came in and said, yes, we can come up with vaccines by the millions to inoculate people. 3, government stepped up to the plate and said, we're going to support the science, we're going to support the industry, and we're going to tell people to change your behavior, wear masks, wash your hands, social distance, and stay home at the beginning, lock down, because this stuff's in the air. And we did. The 4th element, the public, we bought into it. Now, there was still a small vocal group, especially here in Ottawa, that put out misinformation about vaccines and all of that, but they were a tiny minority. Most of us got vaccinated. And look, here we are. We're back in person again. And we were told to flatten the curve, and we did that. Those 4 elements came together: science, industry, government, and the public. Okay, climate change is another curve we need to flatten. And have the 4 elements come together. The science is there telling us it's a serious problem. Industry is there with green technology saying we're ready, we can do this. Governments, well, we've had 27 United Nations COP meetings where government leaders get together and say, yeah, it's a problem, we got to do something about it. But the bottom line is, despite the progress, and there has been progress, our world emissions are still going up. So there's more to do. And the public is confused and uncertain because there's misinformation around. Do you know that solar energy is now cheaper than coal? Isn't that amazing? The technology's there. So let's get on with it. There's a phrase I like. The Stone Age didn't end because we ran out of stone. We went from stone to metals, the Iron Age. And then we started mixing metals. We had the Bronze Age. Now we're in the Steel and Glass Age. Okay, we've had the Carbon Age that got us through the Industrial Revolution, and it's been amazing. Now it's time to get on to the carbon-free age. We can do that. Just like we fought COVID in only 2 years, we can move ahead quickly. And the final point I want to make is that this is more than an environmental issue, an economic issue, a political issue, a social issue. It's a human health issue. Because it's been estimated that during COVID, during the first 2 years of COVID, about 5.5 million people died. But every year, between 7 and 8 million people die from burning fossil fuels, mostly from air pollution. In other words, more than twice as many people died from fossil fuel burning as died from COVID. We did something about COVID. Let's do something about carbon. Let's get on with it. The technology's there. Let's move ahead. Thank you very much.
Good evening, everybody. I'm Alexandra Lesnikowski, and I'm a geography and urban planning professor at Concordia University. For over 10 years now, I've been studying how society is adapting to the unavoidable consequences of a changing climate. And now I teach undergraduate courses, both to our geography students as well as our urban planning students, about the science and the public policy of climate change. Now, at the beginning of each semester, I go around the room and I ask my students in these courses to describe what kinds of words come to mind when they hear the phrase climate change, something that we all have heard of, encountered in the news, in personal conversations. We all come into those types of classes with some sort of prior background information and emotional response to that phrase. Now, most often, my students use words like scary, or extreme, and existential. They see events like the 2020 floods in Pakistan or the forest fires in Alberta that are playing out right now, and they fear for what that means for their generation and for the future of our planet. And climate change is certainly those things. It is scary, and it does raise existential questions for how we continue to live in a world that's becoming hotter and less predictable every year. But I also emphasize to my students that climate change is a problem of our own making. And because of that, it means that this is a problem that we absolutely have the power and the ability to solve. So for many decades, this issue of solving the problem of climate change was really framed around the issue of prevention. Our goal was to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions to levels that were low enough to avoid dangerous changes to our planet's climate system. Changes that would make it more difficult, and in some places even impossible, for life to continue the way that it has in the past. But now those changes are starting to happen all around us. We're seeing more frequent and more extreme heat waves, like the catastrophic 2021 Canadian heat dome that killed 619 people in BC. We're seeing changes in the range of species that are bringing diseases like Lyme disease into Canadian communities. Sea level rise and storms are reshaping our coastlines. So climate action is no longer just about prevention. It's now also about trying to respond to these worsening risks. So what do these impacts mean for Canada then? First of all, we know that it's going to cost us a lot of money. Modeling from the Canadian Climate Institute has found that climate change impacts are likely to reduce Canada's GDP by up to $100 billion per year by 2050. Second of all, we know that climate change is not going to impact all of us in the same way. Those of us who are already the most marginalized in our society will likely experience the greatest harm from climate change. So for example, of those individuals who died in the 2021 BC heat wave, most were low-income seniors who were living alone. Third, we know that those who are the least responsible for the greenhouse gas emissions that cause climate change will be the most impacted. So Inuit communities, for example, are warming about 4 times faster than the global average and are experiencing a wide range of impacts in their communities, including on things like community safety, food security, cultural traditions, and mental health. So for me, this question of why we need to adapt and how we adapt to a changing climate is really at the heart of the societal injustice that is the climate crisis. So we have to respond, and we have to prepare. And this now means focusing on adaptation alongside efforts to mitigate our emissions. So when I say adaptation, what exactly does that mean? Now, in one very important sense, that means doing things to reduce the specific impacts of climate change-related risks. So, for example, it might mean creating new flood insurance policies that help to spread the costs of disasters between government and the private sector. But adaptation is also going to mean tackling big challenges that cause some people in some places to be more vulnerable than others in the first place. So we know from decades of climate change research at this point that in order to ensure that we're all benefiting from adaptation, we need to also tackle the social drivers of vulnerability. So that means addressing underlying issues like poverty, housing insecurity, and healthcare accessibility. These are broad issues in our society that we need to confront and deal with for a myriad of reasons alongside climate change. So what this tells us is that climate change and adaptation is not just a technological problem or an infrastructure problem. It's a political and a societal challenge that calls on us to transform our society towards a more just and more equitable future. This means doing things like prioritizing marginalized people in the adaptation decisions that we make. We need to be thinking about system-level changes that can address underlying injustices that create unequal burdens in a changing climate. And we also need to do the boring stuff, like creating monitoring and evaluation systems for our adaptation policies and programs that track the impacts of our actions on risk and vulnerability outcomes. There's a very clear economic argument for undertaking adaptation. For every dollar that we spend proactively adapting, we can save anywhere from $7 to $15 in costs avoided over the long term. But for me, there's also a very clear moral argument for adaptation. Climate justice demands that we confront the societal and the generational injustices that define climate change vulnerability. So I am part of what pop culture refers to as an older millennial. Folks in my generation have come of age as we were beginning to realize that all of these consequences and impacts of climate change would probably hit us much earlier and much more severely in places like Canada than we once thought. My students' generation now is coming of age as that realization is playing out all around us. And I now have a 1-year-old daughter, and I know that her generation will never know a world where we aren't dealing with dangerous impacts of a changing climate. So we can try to deal with these consequences the way we're doing right now, which is incrementally reacting to extreme weather events when they happen, or we can be bold, and we can envision new ways of living and new ways of relating to one another in a warming world. I think I know what pathway my students would urge us to take. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Jeff DeHont, social worker, policy analyst, and playwright. I recently worked for the City of Toronto, and while employed there, a unique housing development came to mind. Deeply affordable units with 24/7 on-site support workers would assist people with mental health and substance abuse issues. All buildings would have a view of a lake, for a reason I'll get to in a minute, and every inch of the building would be sustainable. Various design features would control temperature because, as we've heard, some marginalized folks and some vulnerable folks experience climate very differently than others. So we want to make sure the air is breathable, the temperature is not too hot or not too cold. We want to make sure the water is safe, all these kinds of things. But the big thing about the housing development was that at sundown, folks would get into a boat. Remember I said I was looking at a lake? And they would take a little ride out 100, 200 feet out. And then the buildings would separate from the shoreline and form a hug around the people in those boats. So literally every inch of that property was designed to make people feel heard, seen, honored, safe. Imagine that feeling if that happened everywhere in Canada, that every city you think of offered that. Now, the beautiful thing about housing is it doesn't have to give you a hug to be a miracle. But I do want to keep that concept, so put it in the back of your head for now. We'll move away from the hug, just temporarily, but we'll come back to it. So do keep it in the back of your head. There are developments in Belgium, Italy, Spain, all kinds of different places that are offering beautiful architecture, environmental sustainable development, and social supports and community. So it is done worldwide. I myself I live near a ravine, and I love it. Coyotes, foxes, rabbits, dogs, hikers, just peace and quiet, shade. There's all kinds of things there. So when I leave, I feel safe. And that's actually the concept I want everyone to have, period. I don't feel it's enough to build a house, even if it's a nice house. I think it does something different for people's mental health if it's like, we cherish you. And that ravine makes me feel cherished. I'm privileged enough to live near something like that where I can access it. So tonight's talks are devoted to climate innovations. My suggested innovation is joy in design. I'm not here to say specifics about science or what could go in the housing, etc. It's more to point out that feeling I mentioned earlier. Just imagine living somewhere where that much premium was put on you. We're literally going to give you a hug every night. We love you. And we're not just saying it. That house keeps you safe. That ceremony makes you feel heard. And you get it no matter what. And if you don't want it, then don't go on the boat. It's okay. That's a different kind of housing. And I think that's what we need to get to. So yes, sustainable, and yes, and this is very much tied to climate because we know who's going to suffer most now. We've already seen it. We've heard examples earlier. about British Columbia, et cetera. So in Canada already, in this decade, we've seen what happens to people who don't have great incomes, and the climate goes bad. So housing is part of this, and it goes beyond being sustainable. I think it needs to do something more. Now, there's another reason I'm speaking about joy. Sometimes my thoughts drift to a very dark place. I think of pollution, war, poverty, urban sprawl, pain on a global scale. And my face lies in despair. And my spirit just connects to disaster. That's what happens when you don't feel joy. I'm not talking like, oh, let's be happy and put a smile on our face. Look, we built some very nice housing for people that are poor or have mental health issues. I'm going beyond that. I'm saying we built houses that's medicine for all. Because that joy is apparent. We prioritized joy. We prioritized love. We prioritized care for others. We invested millions of dollars in it and built this beautiful ceremony you can see every night from the sky. Right? Because you would see entire housing developments break and give this hug, or whatever the equivalent can be. So everything I hate wants me to feel despair, wants me to give up, wants to break me. It wants me to feel pain instead of calm. It wants me to give up. And I repeat, housing does not have to hug us to feel like medicine. It can still be sustainably developed. It can still be unique. It can still be built with community gatherings in mind, with or without a crazy design. Imagine a development with a grocery store, a pharmacy, a public market, a park, a library, anything like that. Just anything that makes people feel like they're in a community, anything that makes them feel valued, anything that gives them a chance to gather and feel supported. Just imagine that. I don't care what the specifics are. I'm giving a big idea to illustrate a point, but the specifics don't matter. What matters is that love, right? And what matters is that people see it. Now, close your eyes, breathe deep, right? Imagine housing as social justice and as a climate initiative. What would you add to it? Would there be that park? Would there be a place to watch a movie with your fellow housemates? I don't care about the specifics, but what I care about right now is, with your eyes closed and that breath going in, how do you feel in your cells? What is it doing to you? Is it changing? Are you calmer? Are you happier? Are you more energized? Do you feel that joy? Now, why am I asking you about how you feel in your cells? The revolution doesn't lie in specific details. It relies in a sense of awe. And that's what I want to restore to the climate narrative, is of awe. Like, you just go to a place and you instantly know it's a place of healing. You instantly know it's a place of gathering. You instantly know it's a place of love. And it just changes your body. That's what we need. Now, why do we bring this up? Because if that feeling is there, is that housing truly medicine? And shouldn't housing be the ultimate medicine we provide to all vulnerable people? So that's it for me. Thank you very much.
Hello, my name is Sharon Nyangweso, and I'm the CEO and founder of QuakeLab. So whenever I tell people that I work in the diversity, equity, and inclusion space, I get this brilliant combination of a head tilt, a smile, and a knowing nod. I think I saw some just now. Amazing. The knowledge about my career makes sense to people, not because I am an expert in systems designs and systems thinking, and not because I've been obsessed with history since before I could spell Renaissance, although in fairness, I still cannot spell Renaissance. Rather, it makes sense because I am Black and because I am a woman. For more than 5 decades, DEI has been positioned as a social, an ethical, or a moral concept that focuses on morally pushing folks towards behavior change. However, what we need to understand is that the circumstances we find ourselves in this moment, our current challenges, they cannot be addressed by a moral appeal. Systemic problems can only be addressed with systemic solutions. I'm so excited to be witnessing a slow but seismic change in my industry that gets us to focus less on identity as a prerequisite for this work, and rather gets us to lean into technical skill. And what makes me excellent at my work, if I'm being humble, is my social science approach. So when I do my job, I start by understanding the specific challenge in front of me. Maybe that is pay inequity, maybe it's poor health outcomes, or perhaps it is attrition in product and service use. Then I work my way backwards. I try to understand the foundations of that system. Why was it built? Who was it built for? And what was the specific context in which it was implemented? From there, I tap into primary and secondary data to get an understanding of how this system is either failing or serving specific demographic groups. And using inductive or deductive knowledge, I try to test, and if I'm lucky, I try to confirm hypotheses I have about the current state of that system. Now, having this groundwork allows me to come to the table with some strong starting point about how we can redesign systems that aren't working for anyone, systems that are a little bit broken. But now here's that slow and seismic shift I talked about earlier. My team and I have been advocating for, and we've been privileged enough to witness, accountants, engineers, lawyers, doctors, just the gambit of professionals, start to embed equity into the very technical outcomes of their work, not as a second thought, not because the DEI committee made them, but literally as a technical skill. Let me give you an example. In about 2016, there were about 3 million healthcare workers in Canada. Around the same time, there were 1.5 and 1.8 million Black and Indigenous peoples in the country at around the same time. Black people and Indigenous people cannot be single-handedly responsible for course-correcting the historical inequities that have given us economic inequality, have given us poor health outcomes, and social unrest. It's more feasible, I would say, if those 3 million healthcare workers were technically trained to practice equity as a part, as a skill in the actual practice of their work, in the actual performance of their work. And folks, luckily, this is where we are today. We're moving away from depending on compassionate people as our sole mechanism and moving towards building compassionate systems. When I first started doing this work, I was inundated with requests for DEI training. That usually looks like unconscious bias training or DEI training, which I actually don't do. These trainings are predicated on the idea that our silver DEI bullet is either diversification or general knowledge building. Thankfully, I no longer am asked to do that too much anymore, because what people come to me and my company and my team at QuakeLab for is usually either to help them rebuild and design equitable structures, or, my personal favorite, to train professionals in how they can embed equity into, once again, the very outcomes of their work. We are rapidly moving towards a world where if you are unable to rigorously analyze systems of power, you are unable to seek and use disaggregated data, and you are unable to weave this context into the very core of your work. I'm so sorry to be the one to tell you this, especially on such a lovely day, but you are not, in fact, an expert in your field or in your discipline. So, sorry, everyone leave the room now. So, we're here, but how do we get further faster? First, we must continue to move towards an industry and national standard that prioritizes disaggregated data. This will give us the really critical information, the practical information about where we are now. Second, we need to take that data and accompanying data narrative and make it a requirement for industry expertise. This will give us what we need to understand how we got here. Then lastly, we must turn our predecessors and successors into the tactical process. We must train them in the tactical process of how they use equity to inform their practice and build that skill into requirement and into standard, so it's not ad hoc action, but necessary steps. This will give us the tools we need to get where we want to go. It's happening now, folks. The capacity to build, design, and implement with equity and justice is one of the most critical skills required in the job market today. Are you ready? Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Julie Segal. I lead a climate finance program at Environmental Defence Canada. The purpose of our financial system is outdated. We're in a climate crisis. Wildfires are ravaging Alberta in May, with 20,000 people displaced across the province. Charlevoix, Quebec, was significantly wiped out by spring floods, devastating their infrastructure right before the tourist season, which their community relies on. The world's about 1 degree warmer now than it was before our industrial systems started changing the atmosphere through pollution. The warming caused is happening here at home. It's causing devastation here at home and globally, with droughts, famines across the world. Needless to say, these floods, fires, famines, droughts come back to bite the economy. They have impacts which hurt business, hurt investment stability, but most importantly, they're devastating communities and ecosystems in a way that would not have happened if we polluted less. So back to our financial system, whose purpose is outdated. Finance seems vague to many people. Not everyone likes numbers. Most people don't like math. But our financial system is putting money towards polluting in a way that comes back to bite and devastates our communities. Canada can only meet our climate commitments if the financial sector shifts capital out of polluting investments and into climate solutions. And the same is true globally. The world can only keep temperature rise, global warming to the safer levels if the financial sector aligns with the same goal. To be clearer, every single investment that is made by our banks, our pension funds, contributes to something real in the world. They host our money and they invest it into companies, projects, infrastructure. Those investments currently are making climate change worse. They're making climate change worse unless they're actively reducing emissions and investing in projects that build resilience to the damages against climate change. Right now, our Canadian banks, pension funds, insurers invest far more money into oil, gas, and coal, which are factually the leading cause of climate change and global warming and the resulting devastation, than they do into renewable energy or energy efficiency. Most big Canadian investors have publicly committed to reducing their emissions from their investments, but they're not taking the commensurate action. As a result, Canada's behind. Capital that we entrust to our banks, financial advisors, pension funds, is disproportionately going to things that make climate change worse, and I highlighted that comes back to bite investment stability. Wildfires certainly put a damper on Main Street strolling and shopping. More acutely, over $100 billion of Canadian assets, our assets, are at risk of becoming obsolete as the energy transition happens globally, because our banks and pension funds are still overinvested in oil, gas, and coal relative to climate solutions and the way the world is going. So an opportunity cost exists here. If we're lagging other regions on moving towards sustainable investing, Canadians, we are going to miss out on attracting investment opportunities here, and our retirement savings are being put at risk when the rest of the world is looking to greener solutions. And to be clear, Canada is very far behind everyone else when it comes to sustainable investing and shifting dollars towards that new economy. Royal Bank of Canada was the #1 funder of fossil fuels, of polluting investments in 2022. Canadian banks, we're a pretty small population in Canada globally, but Canadian banks, our banks, were responsible for 15% of global fossil fuel funding since the Paris Agreement was signed in 2016 and the world agreed to limit global warming. So we are behind schedule. Moreover, the emissions from Canadian investments are causing pollution that creates damages at home, but also globally. Areas of Africa are experiencing the longest and most severe droughts, leading to famine, loss of livelihood. We have to shift dollars out of polluting investments and into solutions. So global investment into climate solutions has to increase by 20% year over year over the next 7 years until 2030 for us to transition the energy system. Over $4 trillion in clean electricity is needed alone. So these investments need to happen. But if our investments are still going to an anachronistic polluting economy, it's a missed duty globally, but also a missed opportunity. Canadian financial system is not going its way on its own accord. So solutions exist for Canada to bring the financial dollars, private finance, into overall climate policy, into the right direction. Today, Canada has a pretty comprehensive climate plan. Putting it into action and delivering it is the next step, but plans exist for electric vehicles, for the oil and gas sector, for an electricity grid, but for finance, that's still the climate policy void. Practical implementable solutions that can be put in place over the next 12 to 24 months exist, and Canada needs to get at it to set those policy solutions. And the reason we need those policy solutions is because, as I pointed out, individual financial institutions aren't going the right direction on their own, but also changing the way the Canadian financial system is oriented is more effective to do in a policy swoop than kind of every institution wrapping their heads around it slowly and finally moving in the right direction. So what needs to happen, the solution, is for policy to shift, to expand the parameters of what finance and investment has to think about. Just like the country has targets to reduce emissions, so should our banks and pension funds. It's pretty simple. Banks and pension funds, all business, make strategic decisions, they set business targets, they execute on them. Emission reductions has to be a key part of that if Canada is going to meet our climate commitments and if the world is going to stay within a safer level of warming. The clear conclusion here is that financial policy, while nerdy, is public policy for our shared Canadian interest, for the financial system to work in our interest as depositors and pensioners. And financial policy is climate policy. It is the policy void in Canada. Aligning finance with our climate commitments is what Canada needs to do for a comprehensive climate plan that delivers on our commitments globally and to our communities here at home. I invite you to follow our work at Environmental Defense for ways that you can engage with us to advance this progress. And I'll invite you just to think about the concept of an investment, right? Investments should make sense for the planet, for the people living on it. Investments should be productive for us. Policy needs to catch up to reorient the goals of our financial system. Thanks for listening to my Walrus talks, and I invite you to stay in touch.
Good evening. I am Aphrodite Salas, journalist and assistant professor in the Department of Journalism at Concordia University. I was in a community radio trailer in Inukjuak, Nunavik, the Arctic region of Quebec. I had brought 3 journalism students with me. Inukjuak is on the eastern tip of Hudson Bay, about 1,500 kilometers north of Montreal, or 5 or 6 hours by plane, depending on the weather. We went to learn from Inuit climate leaders, Sarah Lisa Kasudluak, Erica Tegotalik, Tommy Palliser, and others, and to collaboratively share their story of building the very first hydro project in Arctic Quebec. So Eric had suggested we be guests on the radio on the first night to introduce ourselves, explain what we were doing, and to take calls. So you can imagine in a flying community of 1,800 people, word gets around pretty fast when there are new folks there. And on that night, there was a terrible snowstorm. winds of almost 100 kilometers per hour whipped at the windows. It was very dark outside and very cold. We huddled around a microphone with Alexandra, our translator. And it was all going well until a caller asked, "You're a teacher, right?" And I said yes, and something inside me in that moment told me that her response was going to be tough. It was. She said, "My teachers did very bad things to me at my residential school. I hate teachers." And I remember freezing up inside. My students were beside me. The translator was looking at me. I didn't know what to say. So I said, "I'm sorry." And that moment is like one of those moments that you know you'll carry with you to your grave buried in your heart, a moment that changes things. I'm here to share my story and to invite you to look at the world in perhaps what might be a different way. My work at Concordia is largely about responding to the Truth and Reconciliation Call to Action 86 that tells journalism educators that we can and must do better, that generations of journalists have caused great harm to Indigenous peoples by using racist, negative stereotypes time and time again, to stop the practice of parachuting in and out of their communities and of practicing extractive journalism. So along with others and hand in hand with Indigenous partners, I want to do better, and I want to train my students to do better as well. So my research is about working together to find a better way of doing journalism. I explore collaborative methods of journalism as well as principles of conciliatory journalism, a method developed by Finnish researchers that focuses on how we report during times of social polarization. So what does this mean? It means, to me, building long-term reciprocal relationships that are built on trust between Indigenous communities, journalism students, and journalists. It means asking myself every time I start a new relationship with a community, what's in it for them? It means asking for permission from community leaders to work towards those relationships long before we ever set foot on their land. I traveled to Inukjuak in November of 2021, but that relationship started almost 2 years before. After introductions through my research partner, Chris Henderson, at Indigenous Clean Energy. We've worked together on multiple projects since 2018, and along with my colleague, Darryl Brown at Kissick Clean Energy, I have new ones planned through to 2026. So each project involves an Indigenous community that is showing climate leadership in amazing ways, either through a groundbreaking project or a new technology. Answering Call to Action 86 in a way that focuses on the strength of Indigenous communities feels right to me, because as much as this work is about building for a better future, it's also about acknowledging the damage done in the past. And that's why each of my students on my teams must undergo extensive long-term training before visiting communities. They learn about what journalists have done wrong and how a renewed focus on building these reciprocal relationships based on trust might eventually make things go right. And they want to do this work. More than 60 students applied to be part of my 3-student team to Inukjuak back in 2021. And those 3 students have gone on to really wonderful things. Luca Caruso Moro is a journalist and multimedia reporter at CTV Montreal. Virginie Anne moved to the Yukon and is now a journalist at CBC Whitehorse. And Carrie Aquash is a filmmaker, and he just graduated from Concordia with his MA in journalism. So far, I've worked with 9 students to share the stories of 2 incredible communities, Gull Bay First Nation, Kiashke Zagiginishinabek, led by Chief Wilfred King, Councillor Kevin King, 2020 Catalysts, AJ Esquega, and Darryl Brown. Back in 2018, they were the first to build a solar power microgrid with lithium batteries in a remote community. And our story with Inuit climate leaders in Inukjuak is all about vision, building the first hydro facility in Arctic Quebec that will replace diesel for heat and power by 100%. Amazing.
Doing the journalism in a mindful way is one part of the work, but taking care to share the stories responsibly is just as important. So in Inukjuak, we produced 2 short documentaries and a multimedia website. One documentary is called Simeoni Nilukturuk, in his own words, and it features the respected elder as he talks about residential schools, the police-sanctioned killing of Inuit sled dogs, and the forced relocation of his people to the high Arctic in the 50s. That project was particularly meaningful because Simeoni passed away just a few months after we shot his interview. We worked with his widow, Alicina Lukturuk, to make sure we got it right. I screened it privately with her before showing anyone else and asked her blessing to share it. The second documentary, named Inuvik, shares the story of a vibrant, resilient community charting their own path forward, moving away from diesel with bright plans for the future. And when it came time to launch, we organized a world premiere at the local high school in Nunavik and invited those featured in Inuvik and Alice Simoni's widow to speak and share their thoughts, first at home. The next day, we published both docs along with an extensive multimedia website on CTV, and in the weeks to follow, Inuvik was screened by Indigenous Clean Energy at the UN Climate Conference, COP27 in Egypt. And when Canada Pavilion organizers invited us to screen at COP15, we did it together, with the Inuit climate leaders featured in the film, with our partner from Indigenous Clean Energy, with my students, all on stage, side by side. This work is very slow, which is not typical of journalism these days, but I feel that's what's needed. A slow, thoughtful, introspective process that requires a healthy dose of intellectual and emotional humility. I'm not the only one to do this work, but as one of my Indigenous mentors has told me countless times, together we are stronger. I like to believe that. Thank you.
Hi, hello everyone. My name is Megan Leslie. I'm President and CEO of the World Wildlife Fund Canada. And I really want to thank Concordia and the Walrus for creating the space for us to talk about solutions to some of the biggest problems that we're facing. Because the solutions, they're out there. They're happening right now. And when I think about solutions to the big issue of climate change, sometimes I wonder if there are too many solutions, because we fight about them. We fight about which one's the best and which one we're going to do and which one this political party likes and that political party likes. But I come from a school of yes and, kind of like an improv, you know, when something's thrown to you in improv, you say yes and. So maybe it is about sustainable technology. Yes. And maybe it's about sustainable housing that has joy and gives you a hug. Yes, and maybe it's about sustainable finance. My yes and is about nature, and I want to talk about how nature is a solution to climate change, but it's also a solution to lots of other problems that we're facing right now. I'm going to put up a slide here, and for folks who are watching at home, don't worry, I'll talk through what's on the slide. We all know that if we're, oh, yeah, there it was. I need it back. We all know if we're going to fight climate change, we've got to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, so our GHGs. So on this slide, you're going to see a list of GHG sources, so global greenhouse gas sources. Think about sources of global greenhouse gases and put them up in your mind and think about what the top 3 would be. I'm going to ask you to raise your hand 3 times for what you think the top 3 are going to be. And I know this can be intimidating. It's like, oh, what if I get one wrong? Well, I guarantee you're going to get one wrong. I also guarantee you're going to get at least one right. So kind of just do it with gusto and put your hand up. Transportation, nature, industry, electricity and heat, livestock, buildings. If you think it is transportation, raise your hand. Okay, so here in the audience, you know, maybe less than half. I can't see at home, but you keep track of your own. Nature, what do you think? Oh, there's like 4 people here. Okay, at home, probably not. Industry, More hands. Okay, we got a good showing for industry. Electricity and heat. A few. It's a bit shaky. Come on, with gusto, people. Livestock. Oh, yeah, there's lots of hands for livestock. And what about buildings? A lot. Oh my God, like it's almost unanimous, buildings. Okay, so you were right. And give yourself a pat on the back if you chose electricity and industry. Good job. The third one is nature. I heard a gasp. Yes, you're like, oh my God, Megan, how can nature be a problem? I didn't know nature was a problem. Don't worry, nature is not bad, don't worry. But let's break down what we're doing with nature, how we are using our landscapes and seascapes. Nature stores carbon. Remember, we learned that in elementary school, how the tree absorbs the CO2 from the atmosphere, puts it into its trunk and its roots, stores it there, and then it breathes out oxygen, remember that? It's not just trees, it's all plants, it's shrubs, it's trilliums and bulrushes. They store carbon in their leaves and their roots, and when these plants die, those plants get absorbed into the soil. The carbon is in the soil. Healthy ecosystems the soil is rich with carbon. But when we destroy nature, we are releasing that carbon back into the atmosphere. So if we cut down our forests, we drain our wetlands, we're taking carbon that is locked in those roots and in that soil, and we are turning it into carbon that goes up into the atmosphere. And an unbelievable 30% of global GHGs comes from the destruction of nature. So we need to stop that conversion of carbon, that release of carbon, by looking at, well, where in the landscape are there rich stores of carbon that we need to protect? And where there are ecosystems that are already degraded, can we plant new plants and restore those ecosystems and restore the carbon? So we can tackle climate change by protecting carbon in ecosystems and by restoring carbon in ecosystems. But in addition to being a tool for tackling climate change, nature is the building block for biodiversity. That just is a fancy word for the diversity of life on our planet. In large part, we have a steep decline of biodiversity around the world and in Canada, in large part because we keep eating up that nature that it needs. Cutting the forests, draining the wetlands, releases carbon, but that's also habitat for wildlife. Habitat where wildlife forage and rest and raise their young. Biodiversity needs nature. So that means that we can use nature to fight climate change and fight biodiversity loss. Another thing that nature does is it fuels our economy. Let's think for a minute about a little bird. So little bird scatters the seeds that produces a Douglas fir that is then sustainably harvested, processed into timber, and built into a home. That home is marketed and sold, it's heated and serviced, it's furnished, it's insured. That little bird sustains an entire value chain, and we need to make sure that she has a home. So nature can fight climate change, it can help us fight biodiversity loss, and it supports the economy. Anything else? Well, we have the opportunity in front of us right now to do conservation in a just and ethical way if we work to support the conservation priorities of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities. Imagine the restoration of land as an act of reconciliation. Imagine the protection and stewardship of the land as an act of reconciliation. In Aphrodite, which is the northernmost peninsula on mainland Canada in the Arctic, Inuit communities have identified this peninsula and its surrounding waters as critical to their existence as Inuit. Local communities, they want protection for polar bear denning grounds, for the narwhal feeding grounds, for calving areas for caribou, because if they lose caribou, they lose an important food source. That exacerbates food insecurity and is a barrier to food sovereignty. And if they lose caribou, they lose the cultural knowledge about caribou and their patterns, their behaviors. They lose their hunting traditions passed on generation to generation. And if they lose caribou, they lose the beautiful and nuanced vocabulary of the hunt, the migration, and the herd. And that fabric of the language and culture begins to fray. So while the organization I work for has always seen conservation as an important tool to fight biodiversity loss, it also helps us fight climate change. It also supports our economy, and it's also an opportunity to center the priorities of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities and support reconciliation, Indigenous resurgence, and sovereignty. And that is a solution that I can get behind. Thank you.
Wow. I'm a bit of a student for life, so I took some notes, and as I thank the speakers, I'm just going to pull out some of the takeaways. Thank you, Bob McDonald, who has been covering climate since he had long black hair. He reminds us that all the predictions have come true, but the good news is the technology is here. Let's start using it. Thank you to Dr. Alexandra Lesnikowski. Climate doesn't have to stand alone. We need an intersectional approach to this work. Thank you to Jeff DeHont. Joy in design, joy in community. Thanks to Sharon Nyangweso. Diversity, equity, and inclusion as a technical skill and greater expertise for those who take it on. Julie Segal, follow the money, but lead the money. That's the opportunity in front of us. Aphrodite Salas, as we saw in our open video, reconciliation in journalism, collaborating in community. And Megan Leslie, yes and nature, yes and conservation. A round of applause for all of our talkers this evening. At this point, I'm going to invite our speakers to stand up and make their way to reception. I want to give them a head start since I know many of you in the room will want to speak with them. While they do that, I'm going to tell our audience here in the room and at home a bit more about what we have coming up at the Walrus. If you enjoyed tonight's talks, did you enjoy tonight's talks? Well, there's more. On Tuesday, June 6th, we'll be hosting the Walrus Talks Digital Skills. This is presented by Deloitte. And then on Wednesday, June 28th, join us for the Walrus Talks Artificial Intelligence, presented by Google. Hot topics that we're talking about in conversation, gaining those digital skills, trying to figure out AI. Both of these talks will take place in Toronto, but as always, all of our talks are live streamed. We encourage you to opt in for our newsletter. It's the best way to stay in touch with us at the Walrus. For those of you here in Ottawa, we have a table set up just outside. You can do so there. We'll also send everyone a follow-up email, so you can just click through directly. During the reception, you can also subscribe to the Walrus. We encourage you to do so. And we have a special offer for those of you in the room with us right now. Just for you, a full year's subscription delivered right to your door for just $25. Visit the Walrus table, we'll sign you up. That's where we'll also have copies of Bob McDonald's book, The Future is Now, Solving the Climate Crisis with Today's Technologies. And I asked, and he said he'd be willing to sign them. So that's a great opportunity to chat with Bob. For 20 years now, the Walrus has been home to Canada's conversation. And in our increasingly complex world of shrinking newsrooms, if you've been following the news over the last month alone, one by one, publications going down, but also encroaching media and social media conglomerates, our work is more important than ever. And we're able to do this work thanks to our community of support. So help us secure a future in another 20 years by making a donation. You can do so online at thewalrus.ca. You can do so at this table that does all the things that I tell you about. And since we're a registered charity, all donations $20 or more come with a charitable tax receipt. Thanks again to everyone at Concordia University. What's been really fun for me as someone who went to school in Montreal is we get to bring Concordia to Toronto and now back to Ottawa. Thank you for making this conversation possible and for the many conversations we've had together over the years. Thanks as well to our annual sponsors, Air Canada, Inspire, and Rogers. And thank you all for attending and tuning in and being part of the Walrus community. Have a great evening.